Fought against my family's greed as they attempted to forcibly move into my newly purchased house, but with the help of the police, I managed to win. Oop is in his 30s and his younger brother, Dan, is 29. Dan is married with 4 kids. Sil refuses to work, so Dan can't afford to live anywhere but with his parents, in a crowded 3-bedroom home. Dan is the golden child of the family. At the pandemic start, Oop lost his job and couldn't afford his place. Knowing he was about to be homeless, he bought a camper and asked his parents if he could park it on their property. They wanted a high rent. After a few months, Oop finally gets a job at a warehouse that even lets him park his camper there. He works his tail off and moves up in the company, saving his money. Eventually, he buys a house. His family shows up unannounced and Sil and Dan look at the house with greedy eyes. Dan wants to move his whole family in, rent-free. Oop tells him no and Sil attacks him. Oop threatens to call the police and they leave. Oop posts the story first on social media, controlling the narrative among extended family. A week later, the family returns, demanding Oop change his mind, but he doesn't. A week after that, Dan and Sil show up with a moving truck and drill out his locks, ready to move in. Oop shows up, quickly gets back in his truck, and calls the police. Chaos ensues, but Oop finally gets them to leave with police help. Cly. Update 2. Oop's parents ask to meet in public. Dan is with them and they ask Oop to help Dan get an apartment, co-signing and helping to pay for it. Oop says no, pointing out that they wouldn't help him when he was homeless and have always favored Dan. He asks his family if they think he's rich and he breaks down his budget so they can see he isn't. They eventually give up and leave. Sil has been complaining about the parents and Oop on social media, but Oop has ignored it. Oop decides to rent out the other 2 rooms in his house to friends. His family takes it badly, sending his mom to beg him to let Dan and his family rent from him. Oop points out that Dan broke into his house and he would never rent to him anyway. Oop finally gets cameras for his house. Dan discovers Sil has been cheating and the youngest child isn't his. When Dan confronted her about the affair, she attacked him, and their eldest got hurt trying to intervene. Police were called and she was arrested. Once she was released, she went to Oop's house to call him out on his Reddit posts, causing all of this mess. She shoves Oop and threatens him. He says he will call the police and has it on his doorbell cam. Oop decides to take the video from the previous year and the doorbell cam footage to the police and also gives the footage to Dan's divorce lawyer. After all of Sil's shenanigans, the parents seem to come out of the fog and have started attending church. They saw a video post describing the saga so far and came to Oop to give a genuine apology. Update 3. Oop gets into the details of Dan's divorce. Sil actually had her affair partner testify. Dan ended up taking on a lot of the debt to get his name off the birth certificate of the baby but didn't have to pay alimony since Sil ended up working for her family. She got partial custody of the other children, but she rarely sees them. Dan gets depressed and drunk after the divorce and ends up driving to Oop's house. Oop berates him for being drunk but takes him to commiserate in his camper. It becomes sort of a bonding/healing moment for the brothers. Later on, Dan asks if he can borrow Oop's camper so his kids can have more room in their parents' house while he tries to pay down the debts he took on in the divorce. Oop agrees, telling him he will be responsible for any damages. Things have started getting a little better between Oop, Dan, and their parents, but Oop sees the biggest improvement in the kids' behavior. Sil looks down on Dan for moving into the camper and Oop suspects she egged his truck on Halloween, but whoever did it was bundled up in sweats. Update 4. I decided to stay away at least a year because my posts were not exactly boosting family morale. So I didn't log in for quite some time. But then the other day my brother Dan spotted a video with an unbelievably similar to mine in far too many ways. Only it was about an op with a twin sister instead of a Sil. But it had so much of the same. Entitled Narcissistic Parents, Guy treated like shit all his life and then rendered homeless, golden child sibling, keeping the favoritism a closely guarded secret from family while the op was growing up, sister still in her 20s has 3 kids and was pregnant with a 4th, sister's eldest son attacks op, and above all them trying to steal the op's house by breaking in while he wasn't home. So many parts were nearly identical. Even 2 lines like "suck it up and my house is not up for grabs" were in the video. My parents and brother are frankly pissed, and I wasn't happy seeing the video either. We've all been trying hard to get past our previous family dynamic and what ex-Sil put us all through. You can imagine it took a lot for me to let go of my grudges. But in a year my parents and Dan have improved more than I'd seen in my entire life before that. And I love me nibblings to pieces. So whoever wrote that copycat story, congratulations, you just sent my entire family right back into eating therapy. And yes, my family is aware I'm making this post. Now with that rant over, here's what I hope to be my final update. Now for what was stated in the title. I had a few naysayers before. But Dan kept his word. My camper was returned to me a few months ago, and in good condition. Dan took good care of it, and thoroughly cleaned it before giving it back. He and our father also resealed the roof on it once while it was in their care. Inside it's no worse for wear than it was when I was living in it. Only I got it back smelling like pine cleaner. There was some minor drama while Dan was living in my camper from a neighbor right behind them. Not quite sure she qualifies as a Karen. But she was close enough. She started yelling at them from over the fence about the camper. And started threatening police. My brother and father went off on her, and then explained Dan was living in the camper so his son could have his bedroom. Well, the neighbor still wasn't happy, but stopped with the threats. My father talked to her husband later though, and he was bull mad at her. Then he apologized on her behalf, and said Dan was doing a good thing by giving up his room to his son. The neighbor husband also congratulated Dan on kicking out ex-Sil, and said he was always afraid to mention before. But she was just a horrid woman. We can all agree on that now. So yeah, the neighbors aren't a problem anymore. Dan and our father managed to get some money together on the side, and bought a slightly bigger camper to set up in our parents' backyard. We needed my truck just to move it. But we got it in there. It's basically the best Dan can do right now till the credit debts his ex piled up are paid off. And even then, he's got the future of his kids to plan for. He may be living in that camper for the next 10 years. But it's preferable to how it was when he was married. His ex-wife certainly can't and won't be contributing to college funds for the kids. Except maybe for her ear baby. Dan's camper is admittedly better than mine, and it's newer, bigger, and has its own bathroom. Mine does not. Although Dan never really uses said bathroom. It's basically become a closet since the toilet and shower are so tiny. If he needs to take a leak or something, he just goes in the house. Dan and I had a joking laugh about me being jealous he's got the better hobo house. And we bantered like sarcastic gentlemen about it. He's kitted out his camper with some better amenities. Like a flat screen TV complete with streaming, video games, and DVD. He said it feels like he really has his own place now, even though he's just in the backyard. And he's much happier now that he's divorced. Dan tells me one day he'll get a truck too, just so he can move the camper on his own someday. But for now he's sticking with his minivan for the sake of his kids. So his camper is sitting pretty where it is, and mine is back in my backyard where it belongs. Though it's not gone unused. I temporarily rented it to a cousin who moved into the area for work. And they were only in the camper about a month before finding their own apartment. Other than that, it serves as a guest house when needed. Relatives come by to use it when in town so as to not need a motel. My nephew has come over to stay in it a few times for fun as well. His sisters don't really have an interest. The camper the closest he's ever been to camping. Same here sadly, because I didn't buy that camper to camp, but to live. As for my parents, they've gotten therapy. My mother got medicated for her mental problems, and fully acknowledges her terrible past mistakes as a parent with all of the favoritism, as does my father. My father is still awkward around me. But he's been fairly active in his church, and is working hard to rebuild the family reputation as best he can. And Dan has cut back on drinking a lot since he isn't so stressed out anymore. He's even taken up exercising. He's in pretty good shape now. And, he told me his ex-wife saw the picture of him he posted online after shedding 20 pounds and called him to compliment. He didn't take the bait. As for the holidays, my parents, brother and nibblings all came to my Christmas Eve party last year, along with most of the other relatives who came the year prior. No problems at all, save for the fact none of them could stay the night in my spare rooms anymore since I rented them out. Both of my tenants were away seeing their own families too. Things went swimmingly. Not only was ex-Sil not invited, she wouldn't have been able to crash the party anyway because of my restraining order against her. But she also barely made any attempt to spend time with her other kids either. She only bothered to see them twice a month at best. She didn't even send them any gifts for Christmas or birthdays since being outed as a cheater. And the kids were initially pretty upset about that. But now they just don't care. Ex-Sil I guess decided she was gonna try to live like she was single again, despite having a baby at home. And it didn't go well because life gave her one hell of a cheese slap. On New Year's, ex-Sil went out late to party like it was 1999. And she got pulled over by a cop on her way home. She got arrested for DUI, and her car was impounded. She called Dan while being arrested begging him to come get her car to keep it from going to impound. He told her he was not helping her, and she could deal with it herself. Dan has drank and drove, so it was kinda a little hypocritical. But this woman put him through so much, I don't blame him for rebuffing her. Some flying monkey of ex-Sils called Dan to berate about him being a terrible person. Pretty sure this was the same woman who called me a while back. Dan had none of her shit, and went off on her with a long tirade about his ex's cheating, what happened in the divorce, and that he has no sympathy for his ex since she left him with mounds of credit card debt and she does nothing or their kids anymore. The flying monkey didn't call back. We still don't know who she was. But Dan said she sounded like a religious nut. Ex-Sil went to court, and she pleaded guilty for the DUI. Dan found this out because she called him claiming that because of the DUI, she wouldn't be seeing her other kids anytime soon. She told him she was sentenced to take a 6-month DUI class, in which time her license is suspended until completion. And she won't be allowed to drink at all. Which is the part she was most upset about. I've heard of these classes before. They make you take regular and at times random urine tests, and when you finally get your license back, you have to have a camera and breathalyzer installed in your car for a year. Also increased insurance rates for the DUI on record. Ex-Sil has not been having a fun time. But I have no pity for her. I don't drink and drive. Sadly that's all the info I have on ex-Sil, as she's kept minimal contact with Dan for some time now. And eventually she'll probably stop contacting him altogether unless absolutely necessary. I don't know anything else about Syl's parents, or her affair baby. Even Dan doesn't know. But I do still have a bit of info on someone else. Remember ex-Syl's affair partner, the bronze-tongued lout? Well, he made his social media public again. And he doesn't seem to acknowledge the existence of ex-Syl or his child at all. Dan tried to message him, and promptly got an immediate block. So the guy is just being an ass and acting like his shit don't stink. Whatever. His knocking up ex-Syl got her out of the family anyway.